Since then, in religion, the determination of the consciousness proper of spirit does not have the form of free otherness. Spirit's existence is distinct from its self-consciousness, and its reality proper falls outside of religion. There is indeed one spirit of both, but its consciousness does not embrace both together, and religion appears as a part of existence, of conduct and activity, whose other part is the life lived in its real world. As we now know that spirit in its own world and spirit conscious of itself as spirit, or spirit in religion, are the same, the perfection of religion consists in the two becoming identical with each other. Not only that religion concerns itself with spirit's reality, but conversely that spirit, as self-conscious spirit, becomes actual to itself and object of its consciousness. So far as spirit in religion pictures itself to itself, it is indeed consciousness, and the reality enclosed within religion is the shape and the guise of its picture thinking. But in this picture thinking, reality does not receive its perfect due. That is, to be not merely a guise, but an independent, free existence. And conversely, because it lacks perfection within itself, it is a specific shape which does not attain to what it ought to show forth, that is, spirit that is conscious of itself. If its shape is to express spirit itself, it must be nothing else than spirit, and spirit must appear to itself or be in actuality what it is in its essence. Only by so doing would that also be obtained which may seem to be the demand for the opposite, that is, that the object of its consciousness have at the same time the form of free actuality. But only spirit that is object to itself, as absolute spirit, is conscious of itself as a free actuality to the extent that it is and remains conscious of itself therein. Paragraph 678 is the first long paragraph now in this introductory portion to this religion section of the work, and I think it can be a bit confusing upon a first or even second, 10th, 25th read, unless you keep in mind one main thing here, which is that in using the term religion, Hegel is not naming exactly the same thing in every instance of the term. So in classical, linguistics or study of language, we could say that this is not a univocal term where it designates exactly the same thing each time, but it's more an equivocal or analogical term. And part of what this you could say the key to this is that term, the perfection of religion, when religion is brought to its fulfillment. Now, it's not perfection in the sense of like being immaculate or nothing is wrong with it. Rather, the German word for this is very similar to the Greek term that gets used in philosophy that often gets translated as perfection, meaning to be brought to the end of its development or the end of its process. So that's something to keep in mind. He is thinking about that here, but he's also thinking about the uses of religion in previous parts of the phenomenology, as we've seen in just the paragraphs before this, and he's talking about religion as, determinate shapes of consciousness. So there's a tension here between these different uses of it. The other part that I think that can be a little bit confusing for people, not because of the use of the terminology, but because of the use of a term that in some respects seems kind of out of place here, but we'll talk about, is this over and over again recurrence to free, and talking about that as something that hasn't been yet incorporated. Hegel talks about free otherness, free existence, free actuality. So what's going on with that? Well, let's take a look at the section itself. So this first sentence is a little bit tricky. Since then in religion, the determination of the consciousness proper of spirit does not have the form of free otherness, spirit's existence is distinct from its self-consciousness, and its reality proper falls outside of religion. So it's Wirklichkeit falls out, or actuality falls outside of religion. Now, is this falling outside of religion in totality or falling outside of religion in a certain way? It's really the latter, as the next sentence reveals. There is indeed one spirit of both, but its consciousness does not embrace both together, and religion appears as a part of existence, right? So this is religion in one sense. It's not religion as brought to its fruition. It's not religion as we're going to talk about it necessarily in this section as things are developing. This is religion as we encountered it. Like when people say, oh, I don't like institutional religion, this is the sort of thing they have in mind, right? I grew up as a cradle Catholic, or cradle this or cradle that, and I just mumbled my way through the rituals. Okay, that's this sort of thing over here. That's not what Hegel is talking about in this religion section as the essence and ultimately actuality of religion. So, coming back to that first sentence, in religion, the determination of the consciousness proper of spirit, in religion in this section, at the start, it does not have the form of free otherness. Spirit's existence is distinct from its self-consciousness. So we've got spirit's existence, how it is in the world, right? And then we have its self-consciousness, not just consciousness, but its self-consciousness, how it understands what it is to be spirit at this point, right? So we can line these things up with religion as a part of existence, which we'll come back to in a moment, and then spirit in religion. So let's look at both sides. Here we go. Religion appears as a part of existence, conduct and activity, whose other part is the life lived in its real world. Now, its other part is not this over here, spirit self-consciousness. Its other part is the other part on this side of spirit's existence. Religion is conduct and activity, busying yourself, treiben, doing things, tun. Conduct is probably not a good term to use here. Doing is a better term, because usually we use handeln. We translate that as conduct, but tun, okay, in the broad sense, if it's not just, tat, single action, but it's acting, okay, that's not bad. And the other side of that is still on this side of existence, right? How things are in the world. And you can think about people who, we've got this proverb, about people who go to church on Sunday, and that's very, much where their center is, and then the other 6 days of the week, they just go back to doing whatever they do, right? There's a kind of compartmentalization going on there. Then he talks a little bit later in this section, he says, as we now know that spirit in its own world and spirit conscious of itself, or spirit in religion. So spirit conscious of itself as spirit in religion. He says these are the same. So the spirit in its own world is over here, right? The spirit conscious of itself is what religion is supposed to be, and isn't quite yet in this development as we're going on as the phenomenologist. But it's hinted at there. We see the outlines of it. He says these are the same. They're the same because they're one spirit. They will be the same when religion is brought to its fruition or fulfillment. So he says, here we go. The perfection of religion consists in the two becoming identical with each other. So they're not identical right now. They have to become identical with each other. That's what the religion section is about, tracing that progress out. And he goes on and he says, not only that religion concerns itself with spirit's reality, so religion would talk about everything in human life, right? You're familiar with religion as worldview, right? But that through this, spirit would, in a way that goes beyond the previous developments, it would become conscious of itself. Like he says, it becomes actual to itself and object of its consciousness. Now, how does this take place? This is where he introduces this discussion of picture thinking that we have talked about at various points earlier in the Phenomenology. Picture thinking is the way that Miller likes to translate this. Other commentators and translators very often talk about representation. And for example, in the English translation of Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion, you'll often see representation. Vorstellung, right? That is the term that's being used there. Another term that Miller is translating as guise, Kleider, literally clothing. When I put on my jacket, tie, dress shirt, I'm in a certain, costume, you could say. I'm in a certain guise. If I'm just wearing, a tattered T-shirt, and I suppose I could have accessories like, drinking a beer or something like that, that's a different guise. So that's going to be important here. How does religion frame itself to itself? How does religion represent itself to itself? How do we, as human beings, represent religion in what we're doing with it? So he goes on and he says, so far as spirit in religion pictures itself to itself, its consciousness, the reality enclosed within religion, is the shape, Gestalt, right? We're going to talk about that in a moment, and the guise, Kleider, of its picture thinking. Now, there's a problem with this, Hegel points out. In this picture thinking, reality does not receive its perfect due. And here again, we see the freedom being brought up. What is the perfect due? To be not merely a guise, something that we see, that we can talk about and refer to. It's not an independent, free existence. And here, so we've got free otherness already talked about, free existence, freies Dasein. But here he talks about selbstständiges, independent, free existence. So now this is deepening. We're going to have to come back to this in a moment. Conversely, he says, because it lacks perfection in itself, because it hasn't been brought to its end, it is what is it? The picture thinking, the way in which religion is being pictured. It is a specific shape. And I notice I put here, shapes. We're talking about plural modalities, plural ways, which does not attain to what it ought to show forth, that is, spirit that is conscious of itself. It shows forth something else, right? It could show that forth if you're reading that in there, but there's no necessary doing that. And so these bestimmte Gestalten, these specific shapes that religion takes on throughout history and across cultures, they may or may not convey spirit actually cognizing, making sense of, engaging with itself through the things that people tend to associate with religion. Belief, rituals, worldviews, experiences, all of those things. All of those for Hegel have the potential to be ways in which spirit grasps itself as something more than just this individual experience or even this particular religious comportment. So he goes on and he says, it doesn't attain what it should show forth, right? If its shape, so if religion's shape is to express spirit itself, it must be nothing other than spirit, and spirit must appear to itself or be in actuality, wesentlich, right? What it is in its essence, Wirklichkeit, right? And Wesen. So this duality that we've seen a little bit earlier. Only by so doing would that also be obtained, which may seem to be the demand for the opposite. So we'll come back to that in a second. Why a demand for its opposite? The form of free actuality. We get the third free here, right? But only spirit that is object to itself as absolute spirit is conscious of itself as a free actuality to the extent that it is and remains conscious of itself therein. So when we're engaging in religion in a certain way, there's the potential for not just engaging, but being absolute spirit. How that's going to play out, okay, well, that's what we're discussing in this religion section. And so coming back to this, what may seem to be the demand for the opposite, a free actuality. Why is that an opposite? And why has Hegel been talking about free over and over and over here? Well, spirit and its development is, as he's remarked elsewhere, the development of freedom. Freedom grasping itself. And freedom is not a simple concept. There's no one-size-fits-all definition of freedom. Freedom is actually attained and learned in the process of using freedom. So freedom kind of, unpacks itself. It's kind of existentialist here, isn't it? But it fits into this. And religion is a, overarching way, an overarching human activity, a modality of being human that allows this to happen. And it doesn't just have the potential for it. It's got, for Hegel, kind of an internal drive towards it, which is often not realized as we reduce religion to just one thing among many in the existence of spirit and in human existence, right? This free otherness, Andersein, independent free existence, Dasein, free actuality, Wirklichkeit, being other, existing, being actual, being real. You put these together and you have something like a composite picture of the divine attributes as a free being, right? And so Hegel's talking about God here and our relation to God and how God comes to be realized through a spirit reconciling fulfillment of religion. Now, has that happened at this point? No, but he's charting out for you where he's going and what we're going to hopefully get to at the end of this spirit portion of the work, religion portion of the work, rather, fulfilling what the spirit portion of the work laid in religion's lap. When self-consciousness and consciousness proper, religion and spirit in its world or spirit's existence are in the first instance distinguished from each other, the latter consists in the totality of spirit so far as the moments exhibit themselves in separation, each on its own account. But the moments are consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit. Spirit, that is, as immediate spirit, which is not yet consciousness of spirit. Their totality, taken together, constitutes spirit in its mundane existence generally. Spirit as such contains the previous structured shapes in universal determinations, in the moments just named. Religion presupposes that these have run their full course and is their simple totality or absolute self. The course traversed by these moments is, moreover in relation to religion, not to be represented as occurring in time. Only the totality of spirit is in time, and the shapes, which are shapes of the totality of spirit, display themselves in a temporal succession. For only the whole has true actuality, and therefore the form of pure freedom in the face of an other, a form which expresses itself as time. But the moments of the whole, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit, just because they are moments, have no existence in separation from one another. Just as spirit was distinguished from its moments, so we have further in the third place to distinguish from these moments themselves their individual determination. We saw that each of those moments was differentiated again in its own self into a process of its own, and assume different shapes, as in, for example, consciousness, sense certainty, and perception were distinct from each other. These latter shapes fall apart in time and belong to a particular totality. For spirit descends from its universality to individuality through determination. The determination or middle term is consciousness, self-consciousness, and so on. But individuality is constituted by the shapes assumed by these moments. These, therefore, exhibit spirit in its individuality or actuality and are distinguished from one another in time, though in such a way that the latter moment retains within it the preceding one. In paragraph 679, we see Hegel beginning a thematization not just of religion as coming after spirit and in terms of consciousness and self-consciousness and spirit aware of itself, but specifically in terms of four, we could call them threads or courses or whatever you want to call them, that are being drawn together into one totality, which, we can call it not, we can call whatever we want using, the picture language or metaphors or representation. And those four things are these previous sections of the work up to this point. So, we've got consciousness first, and then we have self-consciousness, and then we have reason, the much longer section, and then we have spirit. And within each of them we have sections and we have shapes of consciousness. So all that's going to come in. Now this also this paragraph touches on a very important question. Are we to understand the phenomenology as sort of a history of consciousness in a linear sense, where consciousness first goes through the consciousness section, and only after it gets to the inverted world does it jump to self-consciousness, which seems to be at like the beginning of human history, or at least the ancient age, right? And the answer is no. There's a much more complex relationship between consciousness, spirit's consciousness in individuals and within societies, and its relation to time and history. And we're getting a glimpse of it here. So Hegel starts out saying, when self-consciousness and consciousness proper, and here's an identification here, religion, right, self-consciousness proper, and spirit in its world or spirit's existence, consciousness, are in the first instance distinguished from each other. So he's going to talk about several distinctions here. That's the first distinction. The latter, what's the latter? Spirit in its world or spirit's existence, its Dasein. It consists in the totality of spirit, and here he uses this term totalität several different times in the course of this discussion, so far as its moments exhibit themselves in separation, each on its own account. So what are its moments? We're talking really big picture here. The moments are consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit, right? These four sections that we've discussed so far, each leading into the other and oftentimes referring back to each other. So, we see spirit taking up things from consciousness or self-consciousness or reason and reworking them. So he says these moments are, and we've named them off already here. Now the spirit thing he clarifies, we're not talking about spirit as it is fed into religion, spirit aware of itself as qua spirit, as spirit, right? We do have spirit that is aware of itself, conscience was being aware of itself, but it's not fully grasping itself yet as spirit, as Geist. For Hegel, it's only partially done so. So he says their totality, the totality of these four, main strains, constitutes spirit. Now, does it constitute spirit totally? We have two polarities here, right? Constitutes spirit in its mundane existence, weltliche Dasein. So we've got Dasein here twice, right? The existence of spirit, how spirit is, how it, goes out into what? Into the world. Mundane existence. It takes a world for granted. It lives within a world. It generates a world for itself. All of that is happening in these four sections of the phenomenology. And you might say, well, how the hell did that happen? I mean, I get it for maybe spirit and perhaps even for reason, where we had observing reason first, and it's like looking at the things of the world, and then it looks at reason itself. But how does that happen for consciousness? Well, think back to sense certainty and the movement to perception and the movement to force in the understanding. It was not just grasping a world that's out there or moving around in a world. It was constituting a world. It was taking an active part in it, right? Especially with self-consciousness, we get the social and interrelational world, right? So Hegel goes on and he says, spirit, as such, contains the previous structured shapes in universal determinations in the moments just named. So structured shapes, we're talking about Gestalten and in universal determinations, things that we've been following along with, who is the master in the master-slave dialectic? Who is the observing reason? We could identify specific individuals, but we're really talking about like types, aren't we? And so these are shapes of consciousness. He goes on and he says, the course traversed by these moments is, moreover, here we go, a little bit before this. Religion presupposes these have run their full course and is their simple totality or absolute self. So this tells us what religion, not as religious ritual as such, but religion as understood in the phenomenology in this portion of the text is supposed to be. It is the simple totality, so we've got another kind of totality here, right? And absolute self of all of these things, and it presupposes that they have run their course. Now, what does that mean? He specifies this does not mean that they have run their course by occurring in time. So this is not saying, first we have consciousness, and then we have self-consciousness, and we have a nice history that we lay out, and around 548 BC in the West, this happens, and blah, blah. It's not that kind of thing, right? That's not how religion is working. And all of these are kind of like proceeding along together and mixing in with each other. What Hegel's been doing up to this point is revealed as, in some sense, we could say it's a simplified, falsified picture of the development of human consciousness. Yeah, Hegel doesn't just write one book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, right? It's not the only place he even talks about historical development or any of the subjects that he's discussed in the course of these developments. But religion in this work, and religion as an actuality for spirit, of spirit understanding itself in a new way, is what happens when these have run their full course and they can be drawn into it. So he says the course traversed by these moments is not to be represented as occurring in time. Only the totality of spirit is in time. Now, which totality of spirit? We've got religion as a totality of spirit. We've got spirit's worldly existence as a totality of spirit. Well, the one that encompasses them both. So absolute spirit, right? Not just one or the other. So he goes on and he says, only the totality of spirit is in time, and the shapes, Gestalten, which are shapes of the totality of spirit, display themselves in a temporal succession, right? So, first you have faith, and then you have the Enlightenment. First you have this developing, then you have this developing, right? Now, I don't know. Do you really want to buy completely into that, or just say, okay, Hegel, I'll go along with you on that. Either one is possible. You don't have to try to fit all of these into a perfect history within your head of world history or the development across cultures or anything like that. Even though Hegel himself was pretty committed to a project like that. So he goes on and he says, only the whole has true actuality, true Wirklichkeit, and the form of pure freedom in the face of another. We see this going back to the previous paragraph, the freedom, the free actuality, the free existence, the free other being, right, Andesein, and these form which expresses itself as time. Right? So in time, as time, two different things going on there that we want to be attentive to. Now, coming back to this, the real meat of it, the moments of the whole, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, just because they are moments, notice what he says this next, have no existence in separation from one another. That's important. You don't first have consciousness going on, doing its thing, totally separate from all the rest of these that we sketched out. You don't have self-consciousness doing its thing as a foundation or basis for everything that comes after it without these already being involved in it. Right? So Hegel doesn't begin at the master-slave dialectic. Hegel doesn't begin at sense perception. Hegel begins in this work with all of these going, all of these having been, all of these in the mind of the phenomenologist who is presenting these things for us in a sort of sequence and order that's broken down into chapters or sections. But in reality, all of these have been happening, right? So the anerkennen, the recognition that assumes such a major role in self-consciousness, you could say, is already implicitly there in consciousness and is already being worked out in more developed forms in spirit and reason. Good to keep in mind. And in religion. So he goes on and he says, just as spirit was distinguished from its moments, these are its moments, so we have further in the third place to distinguish from these moments themselves their individual determination. We saw that each of these moments was differentiated again in its own self into a process of its own and assumed different shapes. So, for example, in consciousness, self-certainty and perception were distinct from each other, which is why Hegel treated them in different sections. Those are Gestalten, and they also contain, we could call them Subgestalten, right? Even more particular shapes of consciousness that are in relation to each other, sometimes conflicting, sometimes developing past each other, sometimes, sublating into something else or sublating each other. So he says each of these moments, right, is differentiated again, and these latter shapes fall apart in time and belong to, now here he says something really interesting, a particular totality. How can you have a particular totality? Well, again, this is part of Hegel's insights and his overall understanding of things. For any given shape of consciousness, it is bounded within a certain horizon within which the things that it takes as essential or as important as, wesentlich, are its world, its totality. And you can look at it and say, oh man, you're so confused. There's more to life than just stoicism and skepticism or the unhappy consciousness, right? Or the master-slave dialectic. They can't realize that fully at that point, though they can have a vague presentiment that what they're doing is, in some respect, partial. They are caught up within the framework that they're working with, a conceptual, an action, a interrelational framework, right? That may have its own history that they consult and its own ends, but they're all particular totalities. And he goes on and he says, spirit descends from its universality to individuality through determination. The determination or middle term is consciousness, self-consciousness, so on. But individuality is constituted by the shapes assumed by these moments. So individuality is a particular shape in the dynamic of self-consciousness, or in the dynamic of spirit, or in the dynamic of reason. And a particular individual may straddle multiple shapes at the same time. This is why the Hegelian dialectic, even if Hegel's wrong about where it's going and the history didn't end and all that sort of stuff that we often, say, Hegel, you got things wrong. As individuals, these dynamics might actually be, or dialectics might actually be, helpful for understanding the situation that we're in when we're trying to figure out why we keep having the same conflicts over and over again, right? So he goes on and he says, individuality is constituted by these shapes. These, therefore, exhibit spirit in its individuality or actuality. They're distinguished from one another in time, though in such a way that the latter moment retains within it the preceding one. That's, Aufhebung or sublation again. And so this is telling us, or at least hinting to us, it's not really telling us that much in this paragraph, but it will in the paragraphs to come, why religion matters. Because it's bringing together these threads and helping us to understand how spirit can become aware of itself, not just as a totality, but also in individuals.